All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for a trip to Bucharest, Romania with the Traveling Librarian. We're joined by Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for another one of his popular armchair travel presentations. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. So this month, we're journeying to Romania, one of Eastern Europe's hidden gems. Well, not known as one of Europe's greatest capitals, Bucharest was a wealth of architecture for many eras, and it's not far from the southern Romania's rural sites. We're going to also visit, and Jeff will correct all my pronunciation later here, Sinaia, a refreshing Transylvanian mountain retreat for the royal family, as well as the Curtea de Argeş, a lovely airplane town close to the castle of Vlad the Impaler. So Jeff is the recently retired head of reference services at the Beebe Memorial Library in Wakefield, and he's an avid traveler and photographer. So again, we thank the Friends of the Tewkesbury Library, along with the Chelmsford and Ashland Libraries, and all 100 of us. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us this morning. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. And actually, I should point out, my last name is Klapes, not Klapes, although in Greek it's Klapis.
Jeff, I've been pronouncing it wrong all these times, I think.
It doesn't, you and the rest of the world, it really doesn't matter. But actually, it is funny because your pronunciation is closer to what it would be in Greek if you were doing it correctly, but you know how things are. Anyway.
Yeah, just do the opposite of whatever I say, folks.
Exactly. I'm going to put my email in the chat before I forget, because as Robert pointed out, I will be taking questions throughout the program, so feel free to pop questions either in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try and answer them as we go along. But also, I'm always happy to take questions later, so after the program is over, if you think of something tomorrow or next week, do feel free to email me at my the address that I just popped into the chat. And I can answer any questions if you would like. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. I can remember where the button is. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for joining me on such a miserable day. At least those of you who are in Massachusetts, it's miserable. Although we're only like 10 miles from Tewkesbury and it's not snowing here. We're getting nothing but rain, but I think we're supposed to get snow later, which is a very Romanian kind of weather, I think. But today we're going to visit the capital of Romania, which a lot of people don't go to because, you know, it's and I have to admit, it's not Paris, it's not London, but it's still fascinating. And I hope you'll see that today as we go through. This was a trip that I took a few years ago now. And if you can see my pointer, I think I may have done for you guys my presentation on Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. And we did spend a week or so there and then took the train to northern Romania, where we rented a car and drove all the way through Transylvania and did a lot of stuff there. And then ended our trip in Bucharest, where we're going to be today. But we're also going to go a little bit into the mountains, the Transylvanian Alps, which actually technically they're the Carpathian Mountains. They curl all the way down here. So the mountains are actually very close to the capital, which makes it nice for doing day trips and quick weekend trips. Romania, just to put it on the map and give you the background, Romania's got about 20 million people now, and most of them are ethnic Romanian, Romanian, excuse me. About 6% of the population is Hungarian or ethnic Hungarian, and they tend to live, not surprisingly, in the border in this area here as you head towards, and actually at various points in the past, Romania was split among other different empires, including the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so for a long time, this western part of Romania was actually part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's still a lot of ethnic Hungarians living in that part of the country, and you'll hear Hungarian spoken quite frequently. Someone is pointing out that Romania does border Ukraine, where of course we all know what's going on there right now. Ukraine is way on the northern border though, so depending on where you're traveling in Romania, I don't think I'd be particularly concerned about safety right now, unless between now and then Putin decides to invade Romania. Bucharest is actually way down in the south. It actually is much closer to the Bulgarian border here. So unless you're traveling in the border regions, and particularly, I think right now Moldova, which is another kind of a part that I'm sure Putin would love to have back someday, that's got a few concerns right now too. But I think right now Romania is generally a very safe place to travel. Bucharest itself, the capital, is on a very flat open plain. So we've got the mountains here, which are fairly high, but then they immediately tail off into this very flat plain, which used to be known as Wallachia. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And Bucharest is not far from the Bulgarian border. And in fact, it's the Danube River that forms the border between the two countries down here. And there are often a lot of river cruises. If you've taken European river cruises on the Danube, they very often end up in this part of Eastern Europe. Bucharest, or in Romanian, it's București, is on the banks of a smaller river called the Dâmbovița, and it is a pretty old capital. It became, it's a very old city going back to the 15th century, but it didn't actually become the capital of the entire country until 1862. And it's maybe about 2 million people now. You can see it's a very, very round city. And you can see the river running across the northern edge. Interestingly, unlike a lot of other cities like London or Rome or Paris, the river is not really in the center of the city, so you won't find it as a major focus of the way the city is designed, which is kind of too bad, because it's a very pretty river, but it tends to be on the outskirts. We stayed in a lovely old town, pedestrian zoned area. A lot of the architecture in Bucharest is quite lovely, and like a lot of Eastern European cities, it's kind of a mix of different styles, but mostly from the late 19th century and early 20th century. So there's a lot of Art Deco, there's a lot of Art Nouveau, and sort of Baroque revival kinds of things. You'll see that as we go through, but it's a very pretty neighborhood. Many of the streets are pedestrianized. It's called the Lipscani section, and it was originally the mercantile part of the town. And today it kind of still is. There's a lot of shops and restaurants, as well as a few major public buildings like museums and so forth. Here's some examples of the kind of towers and doodads that they put on top of some of the buildings. And one of the busier streets. Like a lot of cities in Europe, particularly places that get very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer, they, at some point about 100 years ago, built a beautiful covered galleria that is similar to the ones that you'll see in some of the major cities in Italy, like Milan, that has the iron and glass roof and beautiful interiors with shops and cafes and so forth. This is one of the more noteworthy buildings in this part of town. It's called the Palatul, meaning palace in Romanian. And it was originally built by a French architect. You can kind of tell it looks kind of French, around 1900. And it was built for one of the most powerful and oldest banks in Romania. But about a decade or so ago, it was sold to the city. And the intent is that it's going to be sold, turned into a museum for exhibitions and stuff. And I think they are doing that already, but I don't think it's completely been refitted the way it's supposed to. But it's a gorgeous building. And not far from that, in the same block, is the Natural History Museum. I'm sorry. And this funny sculpture that you can see on the front was put in a couple of years before we were there, and it was very controversial at the time. It's a very modern sculpture, obviously, and it's supposed to depict the Emperor Trajan, Roman Emperor Trajan, who during his reign, actually, the Roman Empire covered much of what is now Romania, and it was known as Dacia back then. The monument is supposed to symbolize Trajan and his rule over that part of the world, holding this dog. But it's funny because the monument was kind of, not surprisingly, was very controversial when it was first installed because people thought it was ugly. Bucharest had a lot of stray dogs at the time. They've tried to get rid of those over the years. So people joked that it was really just a monument to the stray dogs in the city. However, like a lot of monuments that are controversial, give it a few years and people got used to it. So it's still there today. For a while, people were hoping they would get rid of it, but nope. It still stands on the steps of the museum. Here's another typical side street. And mixed in with a lot of the more recent buildings are some things that are actually quite old. This is the ruins of an old palace from the reign of Vlad III. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. He's the one who is the historic Dracula, Vlad Tepes. And he was, he ruled during the 15th century, and he had digs in the center of the city, and this is what's left of them now, and it's a museum. And here's another extremely old building from the early 1800s called Manuk's Inn, and it was closed for a few years and completely renovated. When it was originally built, it was an inn, a hotel, the equivalent of a hotel in the early 19th century. And in fact, it is the oldest continuously operating hotel in the city. So even today, you can stay there. It has a restaurant, it has a number of bars and a coffee house and a bunch of stores and things like that. But it's a stunning old building now that it's been restored. This is the other side of the building. And if you go inside through the archway, the whole interior is a courtyard, and you can see on the different floors, all of the hotel rooms are around these balconies that look out into the courtyard that has restaurants and shops and so forth. We didn't stay there because it was closed at the time, but it would be kind of fun to stay in a place that really has the feel of what it would have been like to be a traveler 200 years ago, but with all the mod cons. Not too far away is another old building. This is actually the oldest church in Bucharest, built in the 1500s. Today, Romania does not have an official state religion. However, probably 80% or more of the population are Romanian Orthodox Christians. There's a small percentage of Catholics, a very tiny percentage of Jews, hardly any at this point, given what happened during the mid-20th century. So most of the population is Romanian Orthodox. There's also a few Muslims, but again, they're a fairly small minority. There's also a lot of ugly stuff in Bucharest. This was the behind the Iron Curtain for a long time. So there's a lot of unfortunate socialist architecture in parts of the city and very modern stuff. This is a downtown area not far from the university. There's a huge university in the center of the city, so it feels very young. There's lots of students all over the place. But there's one thing that socialism brought to parts of the city, at least, is a lot of redevelopment with huge, wide boulevards that have extremely wide sidewalks like this, fountains and parks and trees, plantings and so forth. And mixed in with all of this are all these interesting old facades from mostly 18th and 19th century buildings, and a few older ones like this. This is a traditional restaurant. We didn't eat here because, to be perfectly honest, although the building is lovely, the reviews of the restaurant were pretty awful, so we decided not to eat here. And then here, this is a good example of the more modern parts of the city's development, where unfortunately, we'll talk about the dictator, communist dictator Ceausescu, who was in charge of Romania for about 20 years or so, roughly late 60s to late 90s. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. And he did some major projects in the city that leveled whole parts of whole neighborhoods that were rebuilt in this modern socialist style, which is unfortunate. But there still are pockets of these elegant old buildings like this Orthodox church that they left standing in that neighborhood. But probably the most exciting thing to see in the whole city is the Parliament building. And I think if you were to visit Bucharest for only a day or two, this is probably the highlight of any stop in the city. The Palace of the Parliament is the largest parliament building in the world. And in fact, after the Pentagon in Washington, it is the largest building in the world in terms of floor area. And you can take tours. It started under Ceausescu in 1984, and it has 1,100 rooms. It cost 3 billion euros to build. This is a dictator's ego trip, if ever I saw one. But it is quite an amazing building when you get inside. You can take a tour that covers most of the main grandiose public spaces like this. And of course, even today, there are, the Parliament meets there, but they also have conferences and grand diplomatic events and so forth. This mysterious object is actually a light switch, which I thought was funny as we were taking the tour. I've never seen a more cryptic and useless light panel because it makes no reference to what any of the switches actually control. I just thought that was kind of funny. Here I am standing in front of the building to prove that I was there. A little background on the building. The main architect, interestingly, was a woman. And she had 700 other architects and designers working underneath her. And the entire project took about 13 years to come to completion. And she died fairly young in a car accident, so she never really got to see the fruits of all of her labors. And it stands in a very nice park, but it's totally surrounded by incredibly wide avenues with, 8 or 10 lanes of traffic, trying to be as monumental as it can possibly be. And ironically today, as monumental as it is, it's so big that actually many of the rooms remain empty because it's simply too big for the current government. They don't have need for all this space. So there's whole sections of it that don't actually have any people in it. Someone was just, I see in the chat, someone mentioned that there was an episode of Top Gear where the guys raced cars underneath the palace. That's interesting. I've never watched that show, but I can certainly believe it. And it makes me think of the traffic in Bucharest. Anyway, I would not suggest renting a car there. The traffic is kind of insane, particularly where all these incredible wide boulevards are. This is a small church from the 18th century, which is particularly known for its frescoes. It's called the Biserica Crătulescu, and very, very pretty. And I love the style of the brick. It looks like a Byzantine church, but it isn't. It's actually much more recent than that. And here is this kind of unassuming building is historically very important. This is the Ministry of the Interior, which was built in 1938 and for many years was the Communist Party headquarters in the country. And it's important in history because in 1989, in December, the dictator Ceausescu gave what turned out to be his last speech from the balcony on top of this building. And at the time, This was 1989, so the Iron Curtain was falling in other countries in Eastern Europe and in Berlin. And so Romania was experiencing significant and growing riots and demonstrations against the government. And it was clear from the speech that he gave from this building that things were getting out of control. So he was actually whisked out of the city by helicopter from the top. And now this plaza in front of the building is called, this memorial here, which is a very tall kind of obelisk, is called the Memorial of Rebirth, which commemorates the roughly 1,500 people who were killed in the revolution in 1989. It wasn't actually installed until much later in 2005. And again, like Trajan holding the dog, it was widely criticized at the time. People said it just looks like an olive stuck on a toothpick, which it kind of does, but it's still there. And I actually found it kind of striking, very photogenic. That part of the city is also not too far from the major university. Here's an unusual old library building that goes with the university that has the historic part on the top, and then this awkward mix where they put a very modern addition on the top. And here's the main library of the University of Bucharest, which was founded in the 19th century. It's big. It has over about 30,000 students, I think, at this point. And the statue that you can see of the guy on horseback is of King Carol, Carol being the Romanian version of Charles. And he ruled from about 1881 to 1914 when he died. And here's another unassuming but historically important building. This is now a Hilton Hotel. And it was for many years one of the earlier luxury hotels in the city, and it was a location for international journalists who were staying in the city, along with spies and other people who were in the city for various reasons. And it was nationalized by the communists in 1948 and bugged. So staying there was a bit of an adventure for journalists. Now you can still stay there, and it's just a Hilton Palace Hotel. A much more attractive building is the Romanian Athenaeum, which is now a concert hall, one of the major concert venues for the city. And like the bank building that I showed you earlier, it was built by another French architect. Many of the capitals in Eastern Europe tried to emulate a lot of the design of Western Europe to try to establish themselves as the Paris of the East and so forth. So in the 19th century, you see a lot of construction of buildings that are trying to imitate the grandiose streetscapes of places like Paris and Rome and London and so forth. There's also things like this. This is a much less stylish view where you can see this actually looks like the back of my computer desk with lots of power lines and telecom lines running from one post to the other. While I was there, T-Mobile, if any of you use T-Mobile for your phone service, their logo is a bright pink square. And so they were doing a citywide promotion while we were there. So it was kind of interesting to see the entire city was decked out in different artsy arrangements of T-Mobile pink cubes. Here's another interesting public building where this is the School of Architecture, which was built in 1912. And it's a little bit different. It's a more of a revival style. It's kind of a mix of Eastern and Renaissance style. You can see some sort of Byzantine look to it like that. Going back to the Ceausescus, we made a point to go to the cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Not too many people do this, but we kind of thought it would be fun just as a for historic reasons. Nikolai and his wife are buried on the outskirts of the city in a cemetery that's aside from them is actually quite pretty and has some beautiful historic monuments in it. They were originally, after they were killed, they were buried anonymously and separated. And it wasn't until 2010 that they were disinterred and DNA tested to to verify that they actually were who they were supposed to be. And it was confirmed that these were their bodies, and they were reburied together in what is now a marked grave in the cemetery. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about the speech where he was whisked away by helicopter, that speech was definitely not received well. That's the square with the olive on the toothpick, which is now called Revolution Square. The revolution spread. This was just before Christmas in 1989. And he was whisked away and fled to a suburb, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 miles or so west of the city. Only a couple of days later, there was a show trial, and he and his wife were executed on Christmas Day of 1989. So that brought the end to his reign in what was communist socialist Romania. But aside from their burial in the cemetery, there's a lot of beautiful other tombs. If you've visited any of the historic cemeteries in Paris, for example, it has a very similar feel to it. Some of them are actual monumental architecture in and of themselves. Back in the city, there's a lot of trendy cafes that you can sit at. It's, again, because there's so many university students, it's a very young and lively city with a lot of nightlife. There's clubs and cafes that go late into the evening. Here was the view from our hotel at night, looking out over the sunset. And I just happened to catch a couple of fun photos of planes from the airport heading in different directions. This Arch of Triumph, Arc de Triomphe, when we were there, it was being renovated, so that's why it has the scaffolding all over it. It was modeled, as you can probably guess, it was modeled on the one in Paris. There was originally an arch made out of wood in this major intersection back from the 19th century, but they rebuilt this in the mid-1930s, and this is what it would look like. This is not my photo, but this is it, renovated and uncovered by scaffolding. And it commemorates the victory in World War I and the creation of what is now the modern Romanian state in 1918. If you are in the city, I think one of the most enjoyable things to do is a place called Parcul Satelului, which is one of Europe's largest outdoor village museums, kind of folklore museums, along the lines of, say, for those of you from Massachusetts, if you've been to Plymouth Plantation, or what's the place in Central Mass? I can't think of it. Sturbridge Village, sorry. So it's a wonderful, wonderful place for visitors, particularly if you're not going to have time to get out into the countryside. It's pretty old. They started this museum back in the 1930s, and now there are more than 300 buildings of various sizes that have been moved from other parts of the country to show that the variety of architecture from different time periods and also from different regions of the country. So there are farm buildings, there are rural houses, urban houses. And because it's a folkloric museum, they have a lot of traditional crafts, decorative arts, furnishings, a lot of textiles, if you like that sort of thing. It's definitely a highlight of the city if you are at all interested in this kind of history. And even if you aren't, it's just a beautiful park to stroll around in. It's kind of on the northern edge of the city. And again, these are not reconstructions of buildings. These are actual real structures that were saved and moved from other parts of the country and brought here to give you an idea of sort of an overall history of the built environment in the country. I like these kids playing in the water trough here. Romania today remains a very rural country, and that makes one of the joys about traveling around. If you can get out of the city, it doesn't take very long before you really feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. And particularly once you get up into, I think my favorite part of the country is an area called Maramureș. I have a separate program on that, which is a very traditional part of the country, way up in the northwest, kind of on the border with Ukraine. And they have a very unique architectural tradition and some beautiful churches. But not just there, in many parts of the country, the rural lifestyle is still quite alive and well, and they don't have as much large-scale farming as other parts of Europe might have. There are still a lot of very small villages, small farms doing things the way they did decades ago. So it gives you a little bit of a feel of what Eastern Europe might have been like a generation or two ago. But as I said, if you don't have time to travel around the country, this museum is an excellent way to get a sense of the country as a whole and some of its history. And we were lucky to be there in very nice weather. I should point out, Bucharest and Romania in general has some pretty serious weather extremes. It can get very hot in the summer. Bucharest is on a very flat plain, and it can be very dry on that side of the mountain range. And during the summer, it can be very, very hot. And in the winter, it's a mountainous country, so they have a lot of snow. Some of the mountain passes are completely closed off during the winter. So I think one of the nicest times to be there is either spring or fall, which is when we were there. We were there in like September and October. There's a lot of interesting wood carving also. This particular building here, where you can see the wood is almost carved in to look like rope. That is a very typical design from the Maramureș area that I mentioned way up in the northwest. Not exclusive to that part of the country, but the wood carvings there are very well known. Outside of, kind of in the same part of the city, but a few blocks away, is the official residence of the Ceausescus back when they were running the country. So this palace was built in the 1960s. It's called the Palatul Primăverii, Spring Palace, meaning it has about, it's bigger than it looks actually. It has about 80 rooms in it. And it is now a museum that you can book a tour. It was closed when we were there, so we did not get to see the interior. From what I understand and from looking online, much of the interior is still furnished the way it was when they lived there. And it's kind of in a ghastly neoclassical kitsch style that was very popular with Ceausescu's wife, Elena. So if you Google it, you can see some interesting photos of what the inside looks like. And here's one of the large parks. The center of the city doesn't have a lot of green space, but if you go a little bit onto the outskirts, you'll find some large and very beautiful park areas that have formal and informal gardens and walkways and shade, which is very nice during the hot summer months. This is the oldest park in the city, which was laid out in the 1830s. And you can go boating and strolling, and there are cafes, men playing backgammon and chess, and people enjoying coffee in the shade. Mentioning just a little bit of the politics that are going on there. Bessarabia, which what this sticker says is Bessarabia is Romania. Most of the region that was historically known as Bessarabia is now in the modern country of Moldova. Some parts of it are in Ukraine. Some, it's one of those, it's a historic region that now doesn't conform exactly to modern boundaries. And there are a few people, they are pretty much a minority at this point, who would love to see the countries reunited so that modern Bessarabia could represent the historic boundaries. That's politically extremely unlikely, given the governments in that part of the world, and also just because there really isn't a lot of political support for it. But it was interesting to see some of these stickers around the city. Backgammon is really popular. This is Eastern Europe, so backgammon is a very popular game, as is chess. You'll see people playing it outside, mostly men. But again, it's a very young city, so lots of trendy young students walking around in the latest fashions and playing on their phones. And there's influence from the rest of the world. So Burger King is there, although I did like this unfortunate typo, the home of the Whooper. A nice thing about Bucharest, I found, is just how close it is to some really wonderful day trips or overnight trips that are not far from the city. And if you have the time, definitely make an effort to get out of the city and explore the countryside. So looking at this map, Bucharest would be off the sort of south, the lower left corner. I'm sorry, lower right corner. So we're in Wallachia, which is the area south of the mountain range. Wallachia was prominent really around the 14th century and after. And I'm going to take you to this little area here, Curtea de Argeş, which is on the Argeș River, which comes down from the mountains through this. You can see a large lake here where there is a dam that provides electropower. And it's maybe not even 2 hours from the city, through some very beautiful countryside. In fact, Curtea means court, court of the Argeș River. So for a period of time, centuries ago, it was actually the capital of Wallachia, as was a city called Târgoviște, which is now in modern Bulgaria, and then eventually the capital moved to Bucharest. The mountains are stunning. They're often called the Transylvanian Alps, but they are technically the southern Carpathian mountain range. And the highest peaks reach well over 8,000 feet. And even though we were there in the fall, if you drove up over the mountain passes, there was quite a bit of snow. This was about a month before the mountain passes would probably be closed, because the snow really makes them impassable sometime in November. But it's a very popular area for hiking, for skiing. And there's a lot of wildlife in the area as well, although you may, the larger wildlife, like things like bobcats and bears and wild boar and things like that, they're pretty reclusive, so it's unlikely that you'd run into them. It's a pretty wild area. But if you like mountain scenery, it's wonderful to be able to escape the city and be here in, a couple hours drive. This is that large lake, which was created by a dam and now provides important electrical power for the area. The highway that runs north to south through this particular mountain pass is called the Transylvanian Highway. And it was built under Ceausescu in the 1970s, the early 1970s. And after some road in, I believe it's Austria, it is the second highest mountain road anywhere in Europe. Unfortunately, hundreds of people, an unknown number, died during its construction. It was built partly for military purposes as a way of moving people and equipment through the mountains. Now it's just an extremely beautiful scenic drive. And when you get down, this is north to south here, when you follow the road past the lake and get down into the foothills, this little point here where the river turns around is an important spot that we're going to visit in just a sec. Here's the dam and some of the mountain roads in this area. Looking south as the hills get lower and lower as you head towards the Wallachian Plain. The forests here are beautiful, and if you like hiking, there's a lot of beautiful hiking that you can do in the area. And here's a good example of the kind of roads. It's not as scary as it looks. But it's worth stopping at this castle, which is the one that was on that little promontory where the river makes a little bend. This is called Pianari Fortress, and it's a castle that was used by Vlad the Impaler, who is the historical Dracula, and it guarded the mountain passes in this part of the Carpathians. There's a number of other places in Romania, particularly Bran Castle, which you would recognize if I showed you a picture of it, that are called, for tourist purposes, they're called Dracula's Castle, even though they may have next to no connection with the actual Dracula. Most of them, at most, he may have stayed there, or he may have been a prisoner in the castle for a period of time. But of the remaining fortresses that you can visit, this is really the only one that has a legitimate claim to fame to being called Dracula's Castle, because Vlad actually used this fortress. It was built in the 13th century, and he restored it a couple of centuries later to guard the mountain passes around the Argeș River. And you can now visit it. It's mostly in ruins, but the situation is really quite something. You can climb about 1,500 steps to get up to the top of the mountain. If you go to the restroom, it's even more steps. And of course, as in many parts of Romania, you can buy all kinds of Vlad the Impaler souvenirs. This particular castle was abandoned and pretty much ruined by the 17th century and has not been used since then. So now it's just a visitable ruin where they have gruesome impaled mannequins for touristic effect. But the real interest is the historic connection to him, and if nothing else, just fantastic views through the mountains. You can see why this would have been an important location to build a fortress, because it's one of the few north-south passes through the Carpathians, and it occupies a very prominent spot above the river, so they could easily see people coming and going in either direction. But you need strong knees, because as I said, it's 1,500 steps to get all the way to the top. You can see way down below the road that heads through the mountain pass. And if you take those extra steps, if you really need to, I found the creepiest part of the entire castle was the outhouse, which is full of spiders. And not too far from here, this is the pension that we stayed in Curtea de Argeş, which is a beautiful town. This is the town that I said was, for a period of time, the capital on this river. Now it's a sort of medium-sized town that's very pleasant to stay in the foothills. Has a lot of nice restaurants and several really beautiful historic monuments to see. One of which is this beautiful old church. The town now has about maybe 25,000 people, a little bit more. An interesting tidbit that you wouldn't necessarily expect is Curtea still has, as far as I know, it still maintains the world record for rainfall. When in 1947, there was a rainstorm that came through here where 8 inches of rain fell in 20 minutes. And it is still considered the most rain to have ever fallen in a particular period of time anywhere in the world. And you would not expect that in this little place. It isn't a common occurrence, so you wouldn't have to worry about that if you go there. This is a statue of Basarab I, who founded what I guess you would say is the first Romanian ruling dynasty. And the church, which is known as the Princely Church, built in the 1300s, has some extremely beautiful frescoes. And they are original. They're from the 1360s and were restored about 15 years ago or so. So they're really, this is just an incredible building from that time period. The exterior has these this very unusual stone and brick structure, but the interior, the Byzantine era frescoes are just mind-bogglingly beautiful. And now they are in really superb condition, considering that they are, what, 650 years old, roughly, give or take. There's even one particularly unusual one where this is Mary, and she is depicted as pregnant, which is a very unusual thing to see in Christian iconography. This is sort of a provincial town now, so it still feels, although the downtown is quite nice, again, like many towns in Romania, if you go 5 minutes out of the center of the town, you're in beautiful rural countryside. Although it does have its parking issues. We noticed Romanians were quite approximate in their parking. I'm a librarian, so I always have to stop at the public library. And at the opposite end, the north end of the town, is another extremely beautiful historic site. This is the Curtea Cathedral and Monastery. There was a church on this site since the 14th century, but at various times in history, it's been destroyed by fires and earthquakes and things like that. So the current building is a sort of mix of 16th century and later renovations all the way through the 19th century in this bizarre kind of Moorish Byzantine style. But one of the things that makes it unique is, if you can see the little cupolas on top, which are called tambours, are unusually twisted like little spirals, which I had never seen before on any building before or since. And it's located in a beautiful park. It resembles almost a mausoleum, and that's because it is. King Carl I and his queen Elizabeth are buried here, as well as Queen Marie and her husband Ferdinand. We're not going to talk about Marie as much today, but Marie of Romania was a very, very well-known and important figure, mostly in like the World War I, in the interwar period. She could kind of be described as the equivalent of Princess Diana in her day. She was world famous. She was not Romanian ethnically. In fact, she was distantly related to Queen Victoria in England, but she married into the Romanian royal family and became beloved by the Romanian people because she really was their champion during the aftermath of World War I, when people were men were dividing up the country and the remains of the Ottoman Empire. And she was kind of pushing her way in to make sure that Romania had a seat at the table. And she also was a big champion of traditional Romanian crafts and folklore and history, despite the fact that she was not Romanian herself. And the people loved her for that. They really admired how she represented her people. And she did this worldwide. She traveled to the United States. She traveled all over Europe. And she really, in an age before television and radio, she was the equivalent of, like Princess Diana. She was a celebrity influencer that was admired everywhere she went. So she's a fascinating person, and she is buried here in this extremely unusual building. And you can see the tombs when you go inside. This is Marie. She died in 1938. And aside from the famous royalty, it's just a beautiful building with very typical Orthodox style, Byzantine revival style interior, covered with gold. And they echo the twisty columns on the inside are echoing the cupolas on the roof as well. Elizabeth, the Queen, was a fascinating person as well. And in this case, it's kind of hard to see through the glass, but she wrote and painted the Gospels of the Bible. So between 1886 and 1892, she did this project where she elaborately painted and decorated the entire set of Gospels, and they are shown here on display. Elsewhere in Curtea is this lovely little church called the Olari Church on the eastern outskirts of town. Originally, it was a church for the potter community, the ceramics guild in town, and it was built in the 16th, 17th century. And it's fascinating because on the exterior of the building, it has these beautiful paintings, which are in reasonably decent condition because the eaves are so large so wide that they actually protect them a little bit. Driving in Romania is fun. It's known as one of the more dangerous places to drive, at least statistically speaking, although to be honest, we had no trouble driving around Romania. You do have to just be aware that there's a lot of stuff in the road. It could be logs, it could be livestock, flocks of sheep. This flock is actually on the football pitch on the edge of town. But again, because it is such a rural country, you will find pretty much everywhere. It is not unusual to find dogs sleeping in the road, livestock walking back and forth, carts that are horse-drawn or oxen-drawn carts. And mixed in with that, you will also find young, wealthy Romanian, mostly men, driving incredibly expensive German sports cars at high speed. So I think the best advice I can give you if you choose to drive in Romania is don't worry about it. If you can drive in Boston, you can drive in Romania. But it's probably a good idea to avoid driving at night because a lot of particularly in the rural areas, it's very dark and you can come around the corner and have this in the road. But the countryside is so beautiful that really driving may be the only way to see it if you're not near one of the major cities. So these are the foothills north of Bucharest. And you would swear you were in Austria or Switzerland or someplace like that. The scenery is just exquisitely beautiful, with little mountain villages dotting the valleys, and traditional people selling crafts by the side of the road. And the mountains are always off in the distance, not too far away. One of the most important places to visit, particularly if you're in Bucharest, is a town called Sinaia, which was built around the Sinaia monastery. And that's named after Mount Sinai in Egypt. And it became a spa and resort town. It's only a couple of hours from Bucharest if you head straight north up into the mountains. And for the royal family and for many others, particularly during the height of the summer heat, it was a very easy place to get to. There was, even in the 19th century, there was train service, as there is today. And the mountain air was very cool, and it was supposed to be a very healthful place to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. So it has that feel of a spa town, a resort town, and it's popular even today with tourists and wealthy people just getting away from the city. We stayed in this hotel, one of the bigger hotels in the place, and it's kind of a sort of faded elegance kind of place. And I will point out that I forget, one of these rooms was one of these windows was our room, and there's that will be important in a few minutes when I explain something to you. But it was a comfortable hotel. Like a lot of spa towns, it also had a casino. This was built in 1912 in a very European style, the kind of casino that you'd find in places in Germany or Monaco, places like that. But the city is best known for the Royal Palace, which is now probably one of the most visited sites in the entire country. Castle Pellish, which was a royal hunting lodge, and it was built by King Carol I in the 1880s as a royal retreat. The style, probably the best way to describe it would be German Renaissance revival, maybe. It looks like something you might see out of Disney World or the Brothers Grimm, but it's huge. It has 170 rooms. The tower in the center there is more than 200 feet high, but it has an absolutely glorious location up on this hillside with lawns and views of the mountains and terraces. It was rarely used during the communist era, and in fact, lay vacant for a number of years until after the revolution in 1989, and then it was turned eventually into a museum and a heritage site. And now it is incredibly popular with tourists. The exterior has this very German Baroque Renaissance style with frescoes and paintings on the outside, carved wood, wrought iron, and this is the interior courtyard to the palace. And you can tour much of the inside, which is incredible and very different from a lot of other, if you visited stately homes in England and palaces in France and so forth, this is quite different in terms of its style. So it's a little bit of a different perspective on European royalty. This is the Hall of Honor in the central space, which is a big skylit central hallway that goes all the way up to the middle of the castle. And there are scores of big public rooms, each of which is decorated in a different elaborate style. Here's the dining room. What's called the Moorish room. You can see it's kind of in a Arabian Eastern style. But there's not a square inch that isn't covered with some kind of interesting decoration. And the gardens also are quite beautiful. This is Queen Elizabeth doing some embroidery in perpetuity on one of the terraces just outside the castle. And the views of the mountains around this area are really, particularly on a beautiful day like when we were there, it was just gorgeous. Adjacent to the main house also are a couple of other buildings. This one is Pelishore Castle, built by Carol I for his nephew. So this was for his nephew was Ferdinand, and he's the one who married Queen Marie of Romania. So they had their own little getaway just a couple hundred yards around the corner, built in a very similar style, but the interior is a little bit different. So it still has that very German look to it. But the inside, I apologize for the fuzzy photo. This is a Moore style room where Queen Marie actually died in this room. And most of the interior has a bit more of an Art Nouveau style to it than the main castle did. And also on top of the mountain is the monastery that gives its name to the whole town, the Sinaia. This is the church for the Sinaia monastery. It was founded at the very end of the 17th century, and it was named for a famous monastery to St. Catherine, which is in the Sinai in Egypt. Today, like in many monasteries throughout Europe, there are hardly any monks left. Only a handful still remain in this particular monastery. Another reason to tour this town and make it a base for exploring the mountains is there's a lot of beautiful villas there. It wasn't just the royal family that went there, but also other wealthy people who would build interesting villas. Most of the development happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So again, there are a lot of Victorian style buildings, Art Nouveau buildings, for the wealthy who came up here to relax in the pleasant climate and to go hiking and skiing. And so it's kind of fun to just walk around the neighborhoods. A number of these mansions now have been turned into guest houses that you can stay in. And we also were lucky enough to be there on a weekend when they were having a huge town-wide festival. So there were lots of activities going on, people selling all kinds of local foods, crafts and products, honey, sausages, preserved fruits and vegetables, street food, sweets, lots of good things to eat. It's a very artsy kind of town that still has it still serves the same purpose it did 100 years ago, which is it's a place to get away up into the mountains and enjoy the scenery and the culture that the area has to offer. I mentioned earlier that when I pointed out on our hotel where our hotel room was, and the reason I mentioned that is, unbeknownst to us, part of this festival was that there was a concert that they set up literally in front of our hotel room. This is right in front of us, where a pair of, at least unknown to us, but very famous pop singers in Romania were performing. And they performed pretty much until probably 2 o'clock in the morning, at least, outside our windows. It was extremely loud. This is the view from our balcony, literally outside our window. They had, at the time, they performed a song that was very popular at the time we happened to be there. Again, this is a few years ago. And it was a pretty good song, very catchy, but they played it at least every 15 minutes. They played the same song over and over again, and the audience was singing along. And this went on until, oh my God, it was like at least until 2 in the morning. So it made for a difficult hotel stay, but it makes for a great travel story. If you're interested in hearing the song, I can play it for you, but it will be in your head for the rest of the day. So I'm not sure if you want me to do that. So I'm going to end the program there and unshare my screen and then take a look at the questions. Let's see. Let's see. Going back to the what did we think? Somebody liked the folklore museum. Oh, and someone's talking about Ceausescu. If I said he ruled through the 90s, I misspoke. Yes, he, as I mentioned later, he and his wife were shot by firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989. If I said in the 1990s, I apologize, I misspoke. Someone liked the folklore museum. What did I think about the food? I loved Romanian food. Romanian food is it's very Eastern European, as you can imagine. It's got a lot of it's a meat and potatoes kind of country, but one of the things that makes it delicious is so much of it is locally sourced. It's a very rural country, so you're never far from fresh meat, farm-raised meat, farm-raised vegetables. But in general, the food tends to be pretty meat and potatoes-y, but it's delicious. And there are some wonderful soups and stews, delicious fresh vegetables, and very inexpensive. So I found the food one of the most enjoyable parts of traveling there, particularly if you get out into the countryside and do farm stays. Instead of staying in big fancy hotels, try and find some of those agro-tourism places where you can stay with a family at a local farm and they cook you a homemade breakfast and with stuff right off their farm. It's delicious. Did I drive to Curtea de Argeş? Yes, we drove there. We had a rental car pretty much the entire time we were in the country. So except for the few days that we spent in the capital itself, everywhere else we were driving. Someone wants me to play the song. Okay, at the end, as soon as I finish the questions, I will play the song, and I will not apologize if it's stuck in your head for the rest of the day. Are there memorials to Holocaust victims? Yes, I can't recall any specific ones, but yes. What else? How different is the area at the Ukrainian border? I couldn't speak about what's going on right now, because obviously, given the current circumstances in Ukraine, that might be very different. When we were there, we were mostly, when we were near the Ukrainian border, it was mostly when we were in Maramureș, where you can literally just see across the river into Ukraine. And a little bit further east, in the northern Transylvania area, you're not too far from Ukraine. When we were there, it was a non-issue. And of course, when we were there, you could still travel to Ukraine, and I was very much hoping to go there. But in terms of just as far as safety is concerned, I don't really know what it would be like right now. I would think it's okay, because it's really the far eastern part and northern part of Ukraine that is experiencing most of the wartime problems. It would be something to just be on the lookout for in the news, but I think you could probably right now travel in most of Romania without any difficulty. And the northern part is gorgeous. Aside from the safety issues, there are different parts of Romania actually have very different styles of architecture and the local cuisine and different landscapes. So it's a very varied country, and I would recommend trying to get out and see some of those areas. Are there commercial companies that take day trips from Bucharest? Absolutely. Yes, if you don't want to drive, there are no shortage of places that will take you by bus. You can get to Sinaia in the mountains very easily by train if you wanted to, but there are also a lot of organized bus tours that will take you either for the day or overnight. Absolutely. Another place that's not far from Sinaia that is, it would be a long day trip from Bucharest, but doable, and an even better weekend trip is to go to, and now I'm blanking on the name of the town. Let me just quickly look at my map. That's terrible. I'm losing my mind. Brasov, I'm sorry. There's a beautiful historic city called Brasov, which is just on the north side of the mountains, a little bit further up from Sinaia. And you could easily combine Sinaia and Brasov in a little 2 or 3 day excursion from the capital. And it's Brasov as a city is very beautiful. It's also very close to Bran Castle, which is another one of the very famous castles that's supposedly connected with Dracula, but not really. It's actually more connected with Maria of Romania, who did a lot of the restoration of that castle in the early 20th century. Sorry, and it's well worth visiting completely, aside from any remote connection to Dracula. There are also trips that could take you to Curtea de Argeş if you wanted to visit there without driving on your own. Let's see, can I recommend reading material? I think probably the best thing that I read connected to, and I'd have to look up the name of the book. I can give it to Robert to pass on. There is a wonderful biography of Maria of Romania. And I liked it because not only was it a fascinating biography of her and her life and her influence, but of course it was in the context of that time period, and so much important history happened in Romania at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. So it was a crucial part of the history of the country, and reading about the royal family and her influence and so forth was yeah. I'll tell Robert, so when he sends out the follow-up email with the recording, I'll mention what that is. I just have to look it up. Was there French influence? Oh yes, and in fact I will. I promise I'll play the song in just a couple of minutes, and you'll like the song because I'm going to show you a YouTube version that actually has the Romanian lyrics that you can follow along. And if you noticed in any of the names and Romanian words, Romanian is a Romance language. So it is linguistically in the same family as Spanish, Italian, French, and Latin. So although, and I think you will find that if you read any of those languages, if you're familiar with any Romance languages, you will find that you can probably read or guess at a lot of Romanian, because there are a lot of similarities in the language. The pronunciation's a little bit different, but you can actually guess at a lot of, like if you're reading a menu in a restaurant, you'll see a lot of words that are pretty understandable. However, somebody also asks, is English widely spoken? Yes, definitely in the tourist areas, not so much way out in the rural countryside. But any place that caters to tourists, you will find, like most parts of Europe, people will speak at least some basic English for the purposes of going to a restaurant or a hotel or a museum or something like that. You don't need to know a lot of Romanian, but I always recommend that people learn a few basic phrases just because it's polite and it shows that you have some interest in their culture. It doesn't take long to learn please, thank you, where, bathroom, basic phrases like that. And certainly also, like in many other countries in Europe, younger generations are very likely to have studied English in school. So anybody under the ages of 40 or 50 probably speaks pretty decent basic English, at least. What else? What's the picture in my background? Oh, my Zoom background. I mean, that's my house in Greece, which is in the southern Peloponnese. I forget whether I've done any of my Greek programs for you guys, but I would be happy to in the future. We have an old stone house in the very southern tip of the Peloponnese, and in 3 weeks I will be there eating olives and drinking ouzo and looking at the ocean. Why did I choose a trip to Romania? Mainly because I'll go anywhere, particularly anywhere I haven't been. And I've always been interested in the history of Romania, and it's definitely a country that is, at least for the moment, still kind of under the radar. It's a safe place to travel. It's a friendly place to travel. It's a cheap place to travel. And the culture is just, it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. The scenery, the countryside, and it's just not as touristed. So I think if you want to feel like you're a little bit off the beaten path, it doesn't have quite the tourist infrastructure that you'd find in France or Germany, but there's more than enough comfortable places to stay. And it's just, everyone I know who's been came back just overwhelmed with the friendliness of the people and the gorgeousness of the scenery. And it's just such a different culture. I think you would absolutely adore it. And particularly if you have the opportunity to explore outside of the city. In fact, I hate to say this, but of all the parts of the country I visited, I would say you could probably skip Bucharest if you absolutely had to. It's worth a couple of days. It's not one of the major European capitals, but it still has plenty of things to keep you interested for at least 2 or 3 days. And it's so close to so many other beautiful things in the countryside around. Did I miss anything? So, there's a couple of people in the chats recommending things to read. What source do I use for local restaurant views? For me, you can always hop on things like TripAdvisor and stuff like that. If you're staying in any town, a lot of times I just kind of wander around and see what looks good. And particularly if you see Romanians eating there, I always think it's a good idea to eat where the locals are eating. Because we're running out of time, I will now play the song since everybody wanted to hear the song. And so I need to share my screen again. This is just on YouTube. Actually, what I'll do, if any of you don't want to hear it now, I will put the link to the YouTube. Whoops, sorry, hold on one sec. If you need to go or don't want to listen to it right now, this is come on. That is a link to the YouTube video that I'm going to show now, so you can always watch it later if you feel like. But I will play the song, and for those of you who are asking questions about the Romanian language, this will be kind of fun because you'll be able to see actual Romanian going by. They use the same alphabet we do. And you will probably recognize a few words that are kind of similar to other Romance languages. And this is a love song, as most pop songs are. I have to make sure to share the sound. Okay, here we go. And again, bear in mind, we heard this song from our hotel room, literally like 50 feet out from us, performed live over and over and over again.
Dar fi tu sau altcineva mal la umbra ta m-aș pune. Știu că-ți pare ireal să fugim în lume, sau poți să stai aici să-mi dai culoare. Mai bine îți aduc lumea la picioare, da.
Vreau să ies pe stradă și să urlu tare tot ce simt. Lumea să ne vadă, să ne vadă strălucind. Fără măști cu zâmbet, fără să mă ascund din nou de ei, să nu scoți un sunet. Vreau să mă privesc în ochii tăi. Poate nu mă crezi când spun că s-ar putea să nu-mi ajungă miliarde nopți să te ador. Și încă o dată noi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Și nimeni n-are cum să ne doboare, nici lumea nu mai pare mare. Când noi doi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Te-am așteptat să vii o viață întreagă, e un destin care ne leagă. Nu credeam vreodată că există în lume cineva să mă completeze, să știu că jumătatea mea să mă tempereze. De fiecare dată când ia foc să mă încurajeze, când vreau să renunț la tot. Poate nu mă crezi când spun că s-ar putea să nu ne ajungă miliarde nopți să te ador. Și încă o dată noi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Și nimeni n-are cum să ne doboare, nici lumea nu mai pare mare. Când noi doi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Te-am așteptat să vii o viață întreagă, e un destin care ne leagă.
Da, da. Știi că atunci când sunt cu tine pierde orice teamă. Clipă de clipă lângă mine știi ce mult înseamnă. Și nu mă satur vreodată să te privesc, când tot ce îmi doresc ești tu, ai înțeles, da. Pentru noi nu contează ce spun unii, unul pentru altul împotriva lumii. Prințul din poveste, prințesa din castel, nimic nu ne separă, noi visăm la fel, da.
Poate nu mă crezi când spun că s-ar putea să nu ne ajungă miliarde nopți să te ador. Și încă o dată noi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Și nimeni n-are cum să ne doboare, nici lumea nu mai pare mare. Când noi doi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Te-am așteptat să vii o viață întreagă, e un destin care ne leagă. Și încă o dată noi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Și nimeni n-are cum să ne doboare, nici lumea nu mai pare mare. Când noi doi gândim la fel, simțim la fel, iubim la fel. Te-am așteptat să vii o viață întreagă, e un destin care ne leagă.
Okay, you asked for it. So if you wake up in the middle of the night humming that song, don't blame me. It is very catchy. And I have to admit, I enjoyed it. I just wasn't sure I enjoyed it 20 or 30 times in the course of one evening outside my hotel room. But anyway, I think, is that all the, I think that's all the questions. As I said, if anybody has any other ones, feel free to email me. If you've been and want to chat about Romania, or if you're thinking of going and have questions, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to talk to you.
So Jeff, great job as always. Folks, look for that email for me later today. I'll wait for Jeff to pass along some things, but I will include the recording and the feedback survey and some information about some other upcoming virtual armchair travel presentations. Going to try to try to book Jeff in the next 3 weeks before he leaves for Greece. But I hope everyone enjoyed today's program. I hope everyone stays safe with the snow, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. So thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks.
Yep. Have a good day,
everybody. See you next time.
Bye, everyone.